Homer, the legendary poet, credited with the Iliad and the Odyssey, works that gave rise to all of European literature. His tales of Troy and the Trojan War were so vivid and convincing that the ancient Greeks believed them to be true. Yet no one knows for certain whether Troy ever existed. It remains unclear if the Trojan War truly happened, and if it did, what caused it. Whether the Iliad and the Odyssey were based on real events is still a mystery. We don't even know exactly when Homer lived, if he lived at all, or whether he actually wrote both epics. But this avalanche of uncertainty sparked adventures that not only reshaped how we see the ancient world, but also gave birth to archaeology as a science. In this episode, we'll explore whether there was any truth to the legend of Troy. We'll look at how a wealthy adventurer essentially founded archaeology. And we'll ask, could Helen of Troy really have been the cause of a war?
In ancient Greece, victory over Troy was seen as a national triumph. Songs were likely composed in its honor, the ancient equivalent of a day of glory with tears in our eyes. It is said that both Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar personally visited the memorials of the Iliad's heroes in Troy. But with the spread of Christianity, Homer's epics came to be viewed as pagan heresy and at times were even banned. Later, in the late Middle Ages, and especially during the Renaissance, the works regained their powerful influence on culture. European travelers who reached the Troad Peninsula wrote with excitement about ruins they believed belonged to Homer's epic city. In reality, however, those remains were from cities like Alexandria Troas or Sigean, places that had nothing to do with Troy itself. The first person to seriously search for Homer's Troy was the French astronomer and historian Jean-Baptiste Le Chevalier. Starting in 1785, he traveled 3 times to the Troad Peninsula and discovered ruins of an ancient settlement near the Turkish village of Bunarbashi. Le Chevalier was struck by the presence of freshwater springs, exactly the kind described in the Iliad. Convinced, he declared, "The Trojan War was not a poetic invention, but a historical fact." But without material evidence, there could be no real Ilium, the name Homer used for Troy in the Odyssey. In 1801, British writer, traveler, and mineralogist Edward Clark examined the ruins on the hill of Hisarlik and concluded that this was the true site. 20 years later, Scottish geologist Charles Maclaren confirmed this idea in his work, A Dissertation on the Topography of Troy. The first systematic excavations at Hisarlik were carried out by British amateur archaeologist Frank Calvert. He uncovered the remains of a temple of Athena and a defensive wall from the era of Lysimachus, one of Alexander the Great's generals who ruled part of Asia Minor. We have a fascinating video about Alexander's conquest of these lands linked in the description. But as for Calvert's own excavations, he could not secure the funds to continue.
No one can say how the search for Troy might have unfolded if not for the sudden arrival of a brilliant outsider, the lucky explorer, Heinrich Schliemann. It was he who earned the fame of being Troy's discoverer. Why? Because, by his own admission, he was an adventurer, a braggart, and a swindler. And yet, it was Schliemann who unearthed the remains of Troy and became the first to gaze upon its ruins. He also began the study of the Mycenaean civilization, the very Achaean Greece that fought against Troy. For the last 22 years of his life, he devoted himself to an obsessive quest for ancient truth. In August 1868, in the Turkish town of Çanakkale, Schliemann, a German entrepreneur who had grown wealthy supplying the Russian army during the Crimean War, met Frank Calvert. Calvert proudly showed him the results of his own research. After months of hesitation, Schliemann applied for a permit to excavate. But without waiting for approval, on April 1, 1870, he and Calvert began digging on their own. By the 9th day, they uncovered a massive stone wall. It was a breakthrough.
Schliemann eventually secured official permission to excavate and return to the hill of Hisarlik. Over 3 digging seasons, he uncovered 4 archaeological layers and triumphantly declared, "Here it is, Troy." Specifically, he identified the second layer from the bottom, what we now call Troy II. But there was a problem. The settlement, he found, was small, no more than 100 meters across, and lacked both towers and the legendary walls. It looked more like a village from the early Bronze Age than the mighty city described by Homer. Unsurprisingly, scholars reacted with skepticism. An even sharper blow came from someone who had once been his ally. Frank Calvert, weary of Schliemann's self-promotion, publicly criticized him in the Levant Herald, a newspaper published in Constantinople. Schliemann, in turn, lashed out, branding Calvert a villain, a slanderer, and a liar. And yet he pressed on with his excavations, for which he was praised and rewarded.
On the final day of his 3rd excavation season, Schliemann noticed something glittering in a wall near the western gate. He dismissed the workers and began digging on his own. What he uncovered was astonishing. A hoard of gold, silver, and bronze, more than 8,700 objects in total. The discovery became known as Priam's treasure, named after the legendary king of Troy from Homer's Iliad. Among the finds was the famous golden diadem, later called Helen's treasure, made of more than 16,000 pieces. Schliemann secretly smuggled the hoard out of the Ottoman Empire in baskets of fruit and tried to sell it to France, Britain, and Russia. But all 3 nations refused, aware of the illicit nature of the deal. In the end, he donated the treasure to the Berlin Museum of Prehistory and Early History. The collection was locked away in storage until the end of World War II, when, during the bombing of Berlin, it was moved to a shelter beneath the city zoo. Then, on May 1, 1945, the treasure vanished without a trace. For decades, it was believed that the golden artifacts had been dispersed into private collections or even melted down. But in the early 1990s, it was revealed that Wilhelm Unserfacht, the museum's director, had been forced to hand the hoard over to Soviet officers. Russia later officially acknowledged that Priam's treasure was in its possession. Part of it is now housed in Moscow's Pushkin Museum and another portion in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. In 1994, an international team of researchers finally gained access to the collection and confirmed that it had no connection to Priam or Homer's Troy. The gold was at least 1,000 years older than the Iliad.
But let's return to Schliemann. When the Ottoman authorities learned of the smuggled treasure, they revoked his excavation permit. So Schliemann moved to the Peloponnese, where he began excavating the ancient Greek city of Mycenae. Once again, he struck gold, literally. The discoveries surpassed even Hissarlik. More than 13 kilograms of golden ornaments, royal tombs, and evidence that Homer's stories rested on a real historical foundation. The finds dated to around the 16th century BC, the very era described in the Iliad and the Odyssey. After that came equally triumphant excavations at Orchomenus and Tiryns. These achievements earned Schliemann worldwide fame, recognition, and the reputation of the most successful archaeologist of the 19th century. In the end, Schliemann paid the Ottoman Empire 50,000 gold francs and donated to the Imperial Museum in Constantinople. This allowed him to secure a new permit to continue excavations at Troy. And as for continuing our own dig into the most fascinating pieces of history, we'll need your likes. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel as well. But instead of answers, a discovery only raised more layers, including what is now known as Troy 6. But instead of answers, the discoveries only raised more questions. Years passed, excavations continued, yet clarity remained elusive. In the autumn of 1889, Schliemann began work on the western side of the hill. Before long, a massive structure was uncovered, resembling the royal hall of the Mycenaean city of Tiryns, along with Mycenaean pottery and artifacts from that era. This was a breakthrough. It proved a clear link between Mycenaean Greece and Hissarlik. However, the building belonged to a much later layer, Troy 6, which Schliemann had previously dismissed. Now, old and in poor health, he was forced to admit his mistake. He planned new excavations for 1891, but never lived to see them. On December 26, 1890, he died. His associate Wilhelm Dürpfeld carried on the work. Focusing on Troy 6, Dürpfeld discovered that this city matched Homer's description almost perfectly. Large, well-fortified, and wealthy. Its walls were thick and strong. The archaeology revealed clear Mycenaean influence. And most importantly, ruins and traces of fire indicated its violent destruction. Dürpfeld became convinced the legendary Troy had been found. In 1932, the American specialist in classical archaeology, Carl Blegen, arrived at Hissarlik. He studied Troy 6 in detail and came to a different conclusion. The city had not been destroyed by an enemy, but by an earthquake. Another disappointment. Blegen worked on the hill for 7 seasons, keeping meticulous diaries and documenting everything with photographs and film. He uncovered 3 more archaeological layers, but focused most of his attention on one in particular, Troy 7A. He described it as a city of huts and soup kitchens. The settlement was densely built with small houses. Inside, pithai, large storage jars, were set into the floors to hold supplies. And crucially, there were signs of a siege, fire damage, collapsed walls, and unburied human remains. Interestingly, Schliemann himself had come across the remains of Troy 7 during his first expedition, but dismissed the layer as being too late and ignored it. After Blegen's studies, new excavations at Troy did not begin until 1988. They were led by German archaeologist Manfred Korfmann. Using modern technology, he surveyed the surrounding area and reconstructed the landscape as it would have appeared during the Trojan War. The result was an almost perfect match with Homer's descriptions. Korfmann also uncovered evidence of a Mycenaean landing force dating to the period described in the Iliad. But he did not live to finish his research, passing away in 2005. As of 2025, archaeologists agree that a great city did exist on the hill of Hissarlik, destroyed around 1200 BC, most likely in war. And the layer known as Troy 7a is now considered the most probable historical prototype of Homer's Troy.
But what really caused the war? Homer, if he indeed existed, wrote that Helen of Troy was the most beautiful woman in the world. Over 40 kings desired her, yet she married Menelaus, the king of Sparta. Soon after, Helen was taken by Paris, a Trojan prince. Menelaus appealed to his brother, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, who raised an army and marched on Troy. The characters of the Iliad likely had historical prototypes. For instance, Hittite records mention a king named Akagamunyas, possibly Agamemnon, and a Trojan ruler named Alaksandu, perhaps Paris. But Helen herself is never mentioned. Could she really have caused a war? Romantic notions aside, modern scholars doubt it. Historians now point to money, resources, and control of trade routes as the true reasons for the conflict. What do you think? Could the most beautiful woman in the world justify the destruction of a city? Share your thoughts in the comments. The Iliad leaves us with another mystery, the story of the Trojan horse. According to legend, the Danaans, as the Greeks were called at the time, left a giant wooden horse outside Troy's walls. The Trojans saw it as a gift, celebrating their victory, brought it into the city, and lost the war. Inside, Greek soldiers had hidden, later opening the gates for the rest of their army at night. No archaeological evidence of such a structure has been found, and many experts doubt it ever existed. Yet the image endures. For example, the term Trojan is still used today for computer programs that appear harmless but secretly contain malicious code.